water. Would you? Taking a score from a few moments ago.
Well, we've as a company, we've had a long relationship with the lead designers, LDA Design, working with them on a number of master plans and projects where we've been inputting ecological design into landscapes that are being created or enhancement of parks. So when LDA Design chose to bid for the project, they thankfully thought of us and asked us to lead on the ecology. So that's how we got introduced and that's how we got involved. Yes, well, I suppose you could broadly break it down from the very early stages, which was very much about reviewing the designs as they were at that time, finalising those through the next stages of design, and to the point that they then had to be approved at planning. So we then had to support the planning application process, working with the planning development team with the ODA to make sure that that was happening correctly and that the appropriate approvals were being achieved. Beyond that, it was then looking at the details of the design, the implementation on the ground, tweaking some of those designs, again adding in, getting the planning permissions as and when we needed them, and also acting as a lead in terms of the consultation with all the biodiversity stakeholders, of which there was a fair number, who were extremely interested and extremely engaged in the process and made a lot of very helpful and challenging contributions, which is what we also had to try and deal with. So I wouldn't say there were any particular fixed stages. There was a constant input, a constant sort of biodiversity input and role that we were fulfilling as the process progressed from finalising designs, getting planning permission, and actually then working out how it was going to be put on the ground at the end of the day. Well, because we came in slightly late in the day, although 4 years ago doesn't seem too late, my first visit onto site, there was already significant works going on. The control of invasive species was well underway. There were very strict control measures on site. Some of the venues were just getting underway. The stadium got off to a cracking start, and certainly when I first went on site, the stadium island had already been cleared. But in other parts, particularly the North Park, there was still the Bully Point Nature Reserve in place, and there was still the original landforms of the river, this 45-degree trapezoidal channel covered in knotweed and just about every other British invasive species you could think of. And evidence of the former dereliction and the railway sidings, but most of the buildings are already gone, but you could certainly still get a very strong sense of what the original habitats and landforms must have been like. Well, this is key. It's a key element to everything that we were doing. The Biodiversity Action Plan came out of the very early planning process. It was a condition, a requirement of the condition attached to the planning approval, and it was also something that the ODA committed themselves to very strongly and very firmly. Said we will meet the Biodiversity Action Plan targets, we will deliver what is required, and the Biodiversity Action Plan required a minimum, and that's an important word as well, a minimum 45 hectares of biodiversity-rich habitats that were capable of being designated either as borough county sites or even sites of metropolitan importance post the Games period. So once the park is through transformation into legacy, the intention is that it will be of a quality that is equivalent to the habitats and designated sites that were on the site prior to the commencement of construction. So the Biodiversity Action Plan is absolutely critical to everything that was being done. And because it was a requirement of planning, and because there was a strong commitment through the ODA, it was in everybody's mind that it had to be delivered. And that for me was one of the great pleasures of this project. It's one of the few projects where at no time did I feel that I had to actually wave the flag for biodiversity or fight a corner in particular It was, no, that's something we have to do, we accept that, it's important, it's an integral part of the park. How do we meet these targets? So the basis of our conversations between professionals was starting from a completely different perspective compared to a lot of development projects I've been involved with over the years. So our role really was the guardian of the Biodiversity Action Plan. At times it did feel a bit like I was the man who said no, but that was always well received. I had to make sure that the requirements of the action plan were being delivered, and were being delivered in a manner that was viable and would be recognised as delivering quality habitats and species objectives at the end of the day. So that was one of my key roles, was, if not my major role, was to act as that guardian of the objectives of the BAP. So it was an extremely important element to everything we did. I wouldn't put my finger on one species. What I would say is within the Biodiversity Action Plan there were specific targets for a range of habitats, and there were also specific set of targets for a range of species or groups of species. And that covered just about every major sort of plant and animal group you can think of. So we had a requirement for native black poplars, for example. We had requirements for a range of birds, a range of reptiles, a range of amphibians, a range of mammals, all of which had to be delivered. So that they were the specific targets that were the focus on the species side, which were driving certain habitat designs and habitat requirements. Now, some of those targets were delivered through just by creating the range of mosaic habitats that we have in the park, because we knew that would then support the species generally that we wanted to attract. Some species had some much more specific requirements. So the wonderfully named toadflax brocade moth, as the name suggests, its food plant is toadflax species. So there was a very specific requirement to have, I think it's something like 100 square metres at games time of toadflax strips in the park as a food plant for that particular species. There was another rare beetle, I don't think it was so rare, it hasn't even got a common name. I think it's a thing called Olibris flavicornis, which its food plant is a fairly innocuous plant called autumnal hawkbit. So that we had to make sure that those food plants were designed into the species mixes for the meadows, the species-rich lawns, and any other plantings. So some of the species were very specific, and they drove very specific requirements. We had to build sand martin nesting banks, we had to build otter holes, we had to build kingfisher banks. So some of them are very specific, but others are very generally delivered just by creating the right habitat mosaics. Yes, there's been monitoring of the establishment of habitats and how they're being colonised ever since habitat creation work was being built within the park. So I think we're now into year 3, or if not, it's only 2, if not year 3 of monitoring. The monitoring has been done through Atkins and Arabs, who are the main contractors on the site, I believe. And looking at those monitoring results, then we are already seeing, particularly in birds, good numbers of birds coming back and using the habitats that are being created. And perhaps most excitingly, we believe we have had black redstarts, one of our rarest breeding birds, which is one of our target species in the Biodiversity Action Plan, showing evidence of attempting to breed, if not having bred, within the park last year. Purely in terms of habitats, the main bulk of habitats in the park comprise species-rich or wildflower-rich grasslands and new woodlands. Both were relatively short in supply originally, although the habitats that were in the parkland area prior to construction were very rich in flower terms. They were often associated with what we would commonly call brownfield habitat. So I think those two habitats have been the key gains. There's been some real highlights as well, though. We have got, albeit small, but some significant areas of wet woodland, which I think has been a real challenge. That was a real challenge and been a real achievement to get that into the park alongside the other wetlands, and the wetland bowl I think has been a real success. Yes, I mean, well, yes, there are. I wouldn't use the word losses. Well, I wouldn't, would I? There've been ecological change, and I don't think anyone would tell you that could sit there and tell you there hasn't been. We have moved from a very typical, unplanned, naturally colonised urban environment of railway lines, urban dereliction, and leftover bits and pieces, backwaters, former landfill sites, allotments, through to a much more planned, but I don't believe any less interesting or less diverse biodiversity resource, and one that will be protected and managed into the future. So yes, there are changes, and if you were a particular fan of a particular type of railway habitat maybe, then you would sit there and say, well, that's been lost. But I think it's part and parcel of this balance of biodiversity change that that is important to keep in mind. And the park, in my view, has not resulted in a loss in biodiversity value in the area. There's certainly change, but not loss. I think I would say the wetlands. It's always the way with wetlands. Wetlands are a great habitat to work with because they respond so positively. You get the conditions right, then they seem to grow very easily and they establish as you want them to, and they're a nice, quick fix, as it were. And the wetlands, I think, have been the most striking, and certainly talking to friends and colleagues who have had the pleasure of being in the park during the games, and some who've watched the park develop during the construction process have always said, that wetland bowl, that really is something special. You compared to what it was like, that's an extraordinary change and is a wonderful place to be. So I think from that perspective, the impact it's had on people who visit the park, I think the wetlands and the wetland bowl is perhaps the most successful area. Personally, I'm looking forward to the transformation period when the meadows are fully up and running, and we have a more mature mosaic of woodland and wetland and meadow. I think that's the area that I'm looking forward to being a success. But the main impact has been the wetlands. I think the wetlands and the wet woodlands. They've been very striking. For me personally, I think one of the disappointments, or one of the hopes I had when I first got involved was that I thought we might see more vegetated architecture than we have. But there are green roofs and there are green banks and walls within the park. But from a personal perspective, I would have liked to have seen more vegetated buildings. But then again, I suppose you have to get in very early with that, because it's not something you can easily retrofit to a design. And I can imagine the wonderful architects who built those extraordinary buildings probably wouldn't have appreciated us coming along at the last minute and say, oh, can you just stick a green roof on it, when it hasn't been part and parcel of the design. I hope the legacy will embrace that more, and as the regeneration takes place, I would hope we would see more vegetated architecture, green roofs, green walls. I think we could have done more there, but elsewhere, I think the overall balance of the habitats and to service the requirements. What is a park for people as well as wildlife? I think it's been about right. So, and the quality of the design, the quality of thinking that has gone into getting those habitats right. I'm not sure there's much more we could have done better, to be frank. think the one that struck me most was what I called instant habitat, which again relates to the wetlands. I can still very clearly remember the days being on site watching the planting of the sedge beds and the wetland areas. They'd all been pre-grown. They'd been grown on coir matting or similar, and literally these pre-grown habitats, which had been grown to the design specifications set 2 years, a year before, were being carried out, put on the ground, pegged down, and that was it. They would literally, within an hour, the whole of one wet woodland just appeared in front of me. So I think the skills that the landscape engineers applied in getting those planting palettes right and getting them onto site in a manner that gave the necessary instant effect that we needed, because nature takes time to grow and establish if you leave it to itself. So I think there's a lot of innovation around that I was particularly impressed with, and I think had an immediate and significant effect on the establishment of habitats. No, I think as a team, in terms of habitat establishment, I think the biggest challenge was the water regime. When we first came involved, when I first visited the site, the River Lee was still a tidal river. In other words, there was mud exposed at low tide, and at high tide the river came back up again. And shortly, within 6 months to a year of them being involved in the project, the locks downstream had been built. The river had changed from tidal to a normal fluvial system. So when the high tide was in and the locks were closed, the water levels in the park go up, because the water doesn't stop coming down the River Lee. So it comes down the River Lee, hits the locks and goes up, and it goes down. So twice a day, every day, we have a fluctuation in water levels. We didn't really know when we were designing the wetlands what in reality that fluctuation in water levels would be. It was wonderfully modelled by the landscape engineers, but even they said, well, these are models. Until we've been on site for a year, we're not going to quite know how the water is going to go up and down. Now, if you're designing wetlands, and we were very fortunate to be able to pick the brains of Kevin Peabody at the Wildfowl Events Trust, who has probably designed and built some of the greatest and most successful wetlands, such as the Barnes Wetland Centre in London. His advice to us was, when you're doing wetlands, there are three things that are really important. First of all, you need to have good control over your water supply. You need to have good control over water levels, and you need to have good control over water quality. At which point, everyone in the design team, including the landscape engineers, all looked at each other and went, we've got a challenge on our hands here, because we had no certainty over any of those factors. So we had to then design to accommodate that very uncertain water regime. And I'm delighted to say it's worked tremendously well. The landscape engineers did an awful lot of trialling of planting to see what mixes of species would work in different flooding regimes, which would then inform the planting design. And that was one of the benefits of such a long project, is that we were able to do, or the landscape engineer team were able to do those planting trials, and they were invaluable, particularly in relation to the wetlands. So I think that was our biggest challenge. We were working in a entirely modelled, unreal, unknown environment with factors that were fundamental to the successful establishment of wetlands. And you can see that the wetlands are a central feature to the park. So if they hadn't worked, it would have been a bit of a shock. So I'm delighted they have. But that was, I think, our biggest challenge. It was a joint effort. I mean, the work on the ground was done by the landscape engineers, particularly guys Atkins. Michael Vaughan Atkins particularly was exceptionally helpful. We specified what ideally we would like to have in our mixes, and we looked at the predicted fluctuations. You mentioned 400 mil. That's a typical day, but we were also being told that every month or every 2 weeks it could go up by a metre or metre and a half. So that's what I mean about the uncertainties of that situation. So we had to think about what species were likely to be robust enough to survive that sort of regularity of water fluctuation, but then that occasional much bigger, albeit for a short period, inundation. So we were specifying the species mixes, sorts of things we wanted, but the landscape engineers were the guys who planted those things out, stuck them on the banks at different levels and monitored them and looked at how they cope with silt loading and in flood and all that sort of thing. And that was then fed back into the design team to influence the planting designs. Goodness. A number of things. I think the most important lesson was the importance and value of establishing the role of biodiversity within the project from the outset. And I come back to the Biodiversity Action Plan and the planning condition that required it. I said earlier I was the man who'd like to say no, but without the Biodiversity Action Plan behind me and the commitment of the ODA and the planning requirements, then from my experience with other projects, the thing that tends to slip would be, well, it would be nice to get that done, but actually, I'll tell you what, we're going to do something else. We'll not build that bit of meadow. So I think the most important lesson here for me was the strength and of the planning and the Biodiversity Action Plan, but not only that, the way it was embedded into everything that everybody was doing made it happen. Without that, because the Biodiversity Action Plan was sort of written back in 2008, and between that point and 2012, the amount of changes in design requirements or unforeseen events or new ideas, suddenly we had the orbit or the Great British Garden had to be incorporated somewhere. These things were always coming at you, so you needed to adapt to that. But the Biodiversity Action Plan was flexible enough. It was an excellent document that Gary Grant put together, and that for me was the biggest lesson. Get that right, and then get everybody buying into that as a requirement, which is what was happening. Then you're well on your way, because after that you're actually focusing your energies and efforts on actually solving the problems. You're not arguing about the principle. So for me, that was the biggest lesson. The next lesson or observation, not sure which it is, but the other thing that struck me about this project, literally from the word go, the very first meeting I went to, was the sense of collective ownership of what was being done. Now, whether that, I often discuss where that came from, whether that came from the original bid to win the games, it's just followed through, I don't know, but the collective desire to do the job really well, leave nothing to chance, make sure it's done properly, was palpable from meetings with the planning development team in these offices through to even being on site in the kitchen with the 12,000 men and women who were digging trenches or whatever else. There was that just sense we're going to do it and we're going to do it really well. And if I could bottle that and get that sense of single direction and collectiveness in every project I worked on, life would be joyous. But it's so that was one of the main lessons. And lastly, I think from a technical perspective, I would emphasise the importance of, because we're dealing with habitats and species, the importance of really understanding the requirements. It sounds an obvious thing, but when you're designing to very fine details within very fixed time frames, and there's no room for error or slippage in the timescale, then you need to really understand the habitats and the species requirements and understand exactly what they need and make sure that gets properly fed through into the design team discussion, so that everybody, whether it be the ecologist, the landscape architect, the landscape engineer, can all contribute to finding the right solution to the challenge that you might be facing at any one particular point. Yeah, well, whether it's the scale of the project or whether it was that sort of sense of collectiveness that I talked about earlier, I don't know. But what it made me do in terms of, it made me much more willing to engage in a very open manner in discussing how we all get to the end point. And so I think I learnt a lot about how to be perhaps less defensive about my profession and more inclusive with all the other professions that I've been working with. So that was a good lesson, yeah. I think whether you're a landscape architect, an ecologist, engineer, I think the lessons that I would say take away from this project is the importance of that single-mindedness, that clear objective, what you're going to do, a willingness to absorb and understand your fellow professionals' objectives, disciplines, and what they would normally do and how they do things, and work with them. It sounds all very, very lovely and cuddly, but actually that is how a lot of the time it worked in this project, and that close cooperation between the professional disciplines is what I would strongly encourage, because that will get you the right sort of result, particularly if you're designing what we got here, which is fundamentally a new large piece of multifunctional green infrastructure for one of the world's greatest cities. You've got to work together if you're going to achieve something like that to a good standard, and that's what I'd encourage. In 5 years' time, I hope it's recovered, because it's been so popular. I think I understand, I'll see tomorrow hopefully, but I understand that where the big screens are, some of our lovely habitats have taken a bit of a pounding, but you know, if it's going to be that popular and that well used, then that's a good thing. 5 years' time, I'd like it to be recovered. I'm really looking forward to the park expanding out to the transformation size and all the other additional habitats that we need to be putting into the park. So in 5 years' time, I would like to walk through the park and look at it and go, this is looking good, this is well established, I can see that everything's going in the right direction, and the people in here are using it and enjoying it as we'd hope they would do. So that's what I'd hope for 5 years. Simply, I hope they're loving it. I've worked on a number of parks in London, and as always with these projects, you try and engage with local communities through groups and other organisations. And my experience at other parks is they have all got very passionate local communities who take great ownership of the parks, have a very clear view as to what they like about the park and what they value about it, particularly from a biodiversity perspective, which isn't always necessarily the standard textbook response that you might expect. So I would hope is that the new communities that are going to develop in the next 50 years around this new park will all be absolutely committed to it, loving it, seeing it as a massive resource for them, a place they can formally play, walk, enjoy wildlife. And I hope there'll be groups that will be as vociferous and difficult and objectionable and fighting hard for the park against what might be coming up to challenge it in the future. Because without that ownership and that desire to protect the park, then they're not doing their job. So that's what I'd hope in 50 years' time. There's a beautiful place, but with a community that love it and do everything they can to keep it and to protect it. That's what I'd like to see. As an exemplar for the future, I hope it is. Certainly, if you look at the sort of history of the great parks in and around London, there's a wonderful mix of them, from places like Richmond Park, which are effectively the old encapsulated countrysides, through to the design parks like Hyde Park, and then the more recent parks which have risen out of adversity. But I'm particularly thinking of Burgess Park, which really emerged out of the Second World War dereliction. They've all been designed for people. Primarily the emphasis, except for the likes where you had existing habitat on them, the emphasis very much was for space for people to enjoy and to recreate and get some clean air and a sense of space. But the general trend in all of those parks, and the Royal Parks do this as well, is to maximise biodiversity value as well, because it's seen by people who use the parks as a benefit. It's something they value. They like seeing flowers and plants and animals within the parks. It's something. It's their main place of connection with nature. And however much we urbanise ourselves, there is still an extremely strong bond between us and that desire to see wildlife and to be in open, beautiful places. Here, it's been a fundamental part of the design package. It's always been a park for people, but it's also a park for wildlife. But it's wildlife for people to enjoy. That's a, rather than retrofitting it, it's been a fundamental part of the design, and I think, and I'd hope that that's where all future parks would be seeking to go as we go forward. How involved we're going to be in that phase, I'm not sure. To date, we've always one of the mantras we've had to date has been design once, build once. In other words, we don't want to be building something which we have to completely dismantle and then put back transformation. So we have always had in our mind what the park needs to be in transformation. So we've always had in our mind, how do we in the most efficient and sustainable way convert, for example, the spectator lawns, which have to be fairly robust amenity turf for games, into the final version, which might be a wildflower meadow or even just a species-rich lawn or amenity turf in transformation. So we've always been thinking about that process when we were doing the original designs. It would be great to follow it through that transformation, and I believe LDA Design are advising, and I'd hope that we will do. But it's always been in our minds right from the get-go, right from that moment when we designed anything. We thought, right, yeah, but how can we? This is what it needs to look like for games. It needs to have a certain attractiveness and be of a certain structure. But we know in transformation we've got to convert it to something different. So how would that happen? And do we need to design anything in now to make that transformation easy to achieve? So it's always been there. And yeah, it'd be great to follow it through. Oh, you're asking me to be nice to my colleagues. I'm actually full of admiration for what the landscape design team and the Hargreaves team did here. And I think the moment that I think there was one moment that was a game changer. And that was very early on when we first became involved. The park design had progressed to stage C, and it was at a level that it needed to be at that stage. But it became very important. It became very apparent that if we were to achieve a landscape that was going to be usable for people, that was going to fit with the venues, and was going to be a park that was going to stand the test of time, there needed to be a fundamental rethink of the landforms in the North Park, because the early design stages sought to incorporate a ditch known as the Channel Sea Gorge, which was running parallel to the River Lee. But what that did was it meant that the landforms were up and down, up and down. It meant we had a lot of steeper slopes. It meant we couldn't draw the banks back. And the very bold decision, and I think visionary decision, that the landscape architects took was to say, well, ask the question, why do we need that ditch? And the main answer was that, well, it's a bit tricky. It is main river. It's classified as main river. The Environment Agency has a policy of not culverting main rivers, and if we're going to do anything along the lines you're talking about, we're going to have to get approval from the Environment Agency. But they said, no, We have to get that approval. They had the vision of being able to draw the banks back, raise the park up through the mounds such that when you're in the venues, you could feel you were in the park. That was genius. To me, that changed the game in terms of how the park, particularly North Park, was going to look. And that was down to the vision and courage of the landscape architects in the team. A tremendous admiration for that. That was the thing, and it took 3 months to negotiate that change, and a lot of hard work. But without the vision for it and having the courage to sell it and say you have to do this to the powers that be, and convincing the ODA they were going to back it. Without that, the park would look very different. Apart from anything else, just changing the landforms saved an awful amount in terms of landscape engineering costs. I can't remember how much it was, but it was in the millions, because they didn't have to reinforce steep banks all of a sudden. So that I think was the genius moment, and that was once that was achieved, and then the whole thing really it became clear what we were doing. That was the best thing. That was really good. Very impressed with that.